Live from London, this is BBC News. President Trump says he's made lots of progress on ending Russia's war in Ukraine after talks at the White House with Sir Keir Starmer. President Zelensky will meet President Trump later today ahead of the signing of a minerals deal. The Israeli military publishes a first official account of the mistakes that led to its failure to protect Israeli civilians during the October the 7th attacks. Police in New Mexico say they're treating the deaths of the Hollywood actor Gene Hackman and his wife as suspicious. And Katy Perry is a firework. Well, at least she'll be in one, as she's set to head into space as part of an all-female crew, the first of its kind since the 1960s. Hello, this is BBC News. I'm Catherine Biarahanga. Sir Keir Starmer and President Trump have both hailed their talks at the White House as a major success, saying they've made progress towards ending the war in Ukraine and on agreeing a trade deal between Britain and the United States. The British Prime Minister said it was a moment of tremendous opportunity and called for a peace deal that would not reward the aggressor. President Trump also said he would consider providing the security backstop in Ukraine that Sir Keir Starmer had been calling for. The US president praised Ukraine's President Zelensky after earlier describing him as a dictator. Mr. Zelensky will visit the White House later on Friday, with the two leaders expected to sign a major minerals deal. Our political editor Chris Mason was at the White House. He sent this report.
It is perhaps the ultimate political stage and backdrop, and is now home to a president whose love and command of that stage is reshaping the world before our eyes. The Prime Minister arrived here at the White House for one of the landmark moments of his time in office so far. And for a president who likes a theatrical flourish, the Prime Minister had one in his inside pocket.
So can I present the letter from the King to you?
Thank you very much. Am I supposed to read it right now?
Yeah, please do. So this is a letter from His Majesty the King. It's an invitation for a second state visit. This is really special. This has never happened before. What I haven't got yet is your answer. I do need to.
The answer is yes.
Ukraine is a key talking point here, and there's a key question at the heart of it.
Mr. President, could you be persuaded as part of a peace settlement in Ukraine to provide air cover, a backstop security position to the contributions that Europe might make as well?
Well, so President Zelensky is coming to see me on Friday morning, and we're going to be signing really a very important agreement for both sides, because it's really going to get us into that country. We'll be working there. We'll have a lot of people working there. And so in that sense, it's very good. It's a backstop, you could say. I don't think anybody's going to play around if we're there with a lot of workers.
And what of the president's description of Ukraine's leader?
Mr. President, do you still think that Mr. Zelensky is a dictator?
Did I say that? I can't believe I said that. Next question.
Next, we were kicked out. They went into their private discussions and emerged a few hours later for a news conference where the president said the Prime Minister was a tough negotiator, the war in Ukraine will end fairly soon or not at all, and he was asked, had Keir Starmer persuaded him not to put tariffs on the UK?
I think we could very well end up with a real trade deal where the tariffs wouldn't be necessary. We'll see, but he earned whatever they pay him here and today. He was working hard at lunch, and I'm very receptive to it. I think we, in all fairness, in all seriousness, I think we have a very good chance at arriving at a very good deal.
Our trading relationship is not just strong, it's fair, balanced and reciprocal. We're leaders together in so many areas.
The US-UK relationship has always been close, but there are no guarantees with the new resident here. But for now at least, the Prime Minister's escaped the barbs and frost others have encountered. Chris Mason, BBC News in Washington.
And as we heard there, Donald Trump appears to have softened his attitude towards Ukraine's President Zelensky. He praised him after earlier referring to him as a dictator. And he said the two men would soon be signing a deal regarding Ukraine's mineral wealth. But what's the mood in Kiev? This is the BBC's James Waterhouse.
I think they are less hopeful, less certain than Donald Trump was sounding yesterday. He seems to be thinking or outwardly saying that he expects President Zelensky to sign this deal. From this side, this is a deal that would see America get access to billions of dollars worth of Ukraine's natural resources and oil and gas. But in exchange for what is the question being increasingly asked. It doesn't contain security guarantees yet, such as military presence, air defense systems to help Ukraine sustain a ceasefire after this war ends and to stop Russia from invading again. And so at the moment, I'm speaking to one opposition MP, there is a concern that whilst he is going to have a face-to-face meeting with Donald Trump, that is not to be dismissed. The outcome is harder to grasp, and there are calls here for Mr. Zelensky to involve Ukrainian Parliament more in this decision and to try and provide some kind of guarantee that Ukraine will get what it needs. I mean, we did see a slight warming of language, you're right, from Mr. Trump, where he said they both have great respect for each other. That is a climb down from calling him a dictator. But whether that equates to an agreement which would see an exchange of like with like for Ukraine, I think that is quite another question.
Let's speak to Peter Dickinson, editor of Ukraine Alert at the Atlantic Council think tank. Thank you for joining us on BBC News. So it appears that President Zelensky will receive a much warmer welcome from Donald Trump than many had expected. So what do you think he can realistically expect to achieve from his visit to Washington?
Well, I think one of the key issues here is that it will buy Ukraine some time. The comments coming from President Trump and from the White House and his administration have been deeply disturbing for Ukrainians this last few weeks. This very sharp turn toward Russia, the aggressive rhetoric against Ukraine has really raised fears that the American support for Ukraine is under threat long term. We may even face a scenario where Ukraine was being pushed into a very pro-Kremlin peace agreement, which would place Ukraine's entire existence as a nation under threat. Now, this deal, this resources, this minerals deal, will potentially buy Ukraine that time it needs. It doesn't bring security guarantees. It doesn't even guarantee military aid, but it does allow Donald Trump to declare victory. The deal maker can parade his deal and say, look, we're not just giving Ukraine aid for nothing. We're getting something in return. And Zelensky is able to ingratiate himself with the American president, and I'm sure he will press him for, in the short term, more military aid, and then more long term, the security guarantees that Ukraine so desperately needs.
And how open do you think Donald Trump is towards providing more military aid to Ukraine as it waits for a peace agreement to be reached with Russia?
Well, his most recent comments suggest that he is open to it. He said that he will look at that and he will be prepared to provide aid until a peace deal or a ceasefire at least can be signed. So I think that this deal, now the actual details of this minerals agreement are in some respects quite vague, but it does allow Trump to be able to say that he's protecting American interests and he's making sure that America is not simply financing the Ukrainian war effort and getting nothing in return. So it does open the door for Trump to save face in front of his own electorate and continue the aid. So that's certainly what we'd be looking for today. I think there's unlikely to be any agreement on a long-term security guarantee, but Ukraine will be hoping that they hear at least encouraging words and perhaps even confirmation that military aid in the short term will continue.
And those talks towards ending the war in Ukraine between the United States and Russia, could we see Ukrainian officials being invited to those talks?
Well, at this stage, it does look very much like Trump's vision is for a bilateral negotiation. That's certainly his style. He likes the idea of the big boys, the superpowers sitting down and talking to each other head to head. He's very keen, I'm sure, on having a summit with Vladimir Putin. Ukraine is very much a third wheel here, somehow being left to the side, but they will be involved in discussions. They will be certainly consulted, and President Zelensky will make his case today that they need to be very much involved in that in parallel, if not directly. It's unlikely that Ukraine and Russia will speak directly, very unlikely, in fact. but Ukraine will certainly push their position. Zelensky will today emphasize that it's absolutely crucial that a parallel track of discussion is ongoing between the Trump White House and Ukraine.
Peter Dickinson, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And of course, we'll have live coverage from Washington, D.C. later on Friday, of course, as those meetings between President Trump and President Zelensky get underway there. Now, the Israeli military has published its first official account of what it describes as the mistakes that led to its failure to protect Israeli civilians during the October the 7th attacks by Hamas. The report highlights complacency towards Hamas's military capabilities, with Gaza viewed as a secondary threat compared to Iran and Hezbollah. It says at one point, more than 5,000 members of Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad and other groups crossed through the fortified barrier separating Israel and the Palestinian enclave. Also, in some incidents, wounded soldiers were evacuated before civilians. Yonah Jeremy Bob is a senior military correspondent at the Jerusalem Post and author of Target Tehran. He gave us this assessment about the report.
This wasn't one error. This was repeated errors over at least a decade, that every single time there was a sign that maybe Hamas actually would be a threat, might try a large invasion like they saw, they said, oh, this isn't really serious. Hamas would never do this. This is a fantasy. They're just doing this for training purposes. The Israeli military actually had a document in 2022 called the Walls of Jericho Plan that shows exactly what Hamas was going to do. And there were Israeli intelligence officers debating, is it real, is it not? And they poured cold water on it. The document didn't even get to the IDF chief of staff. We heard directly from him that he did not have the document the night before or at any point in time. So the intelligence really just didn't take Hamas seriously enough. And that's only one of the errors. There's so many errors I could talk about.
And what about the response itself once the attack happened? Tell us about what they've described as kind of failings there.
Right. So even once you are taken by surprise and you have 767 soldiers against 5,000 soldiers, right? 5,000 Hamas soldiers, terrorists, whatever you want to call them. So you're outnumbered, but the Israeli army has 500,000 soldiers and the most powerful air force in the region. Why didn't they send the air force to bomb Hamas as they're crossing the border? Why didn't they send, if not 500,000 all at once, 2,000 soldiers, 3,000 soldiers in the next hour? So the plans were not there. They just had no plan for a mass invasion. The biggest amount of, Hamas people they thought might come across the border might be 70, something like that. And so they weren't ready. And then there was a commander on the ground, General Avi Rosenfeld, who wouldn't admit to his superiors that he had been beaten already around 7 in the morning. So they didn't figure out until about 12 noon that he was completely beaten. And so they start sending big reinforcements around 11 a.m., 1 a.m. Almost all of the 1,200 Israelis, mostly civilians, and almost all the 250 hostages are already dead or taken hostage into Gaza by 12 noon. So by the time they're sending real reinforcements, it's too late.
And that was Yonah Jeremy Bob from the Jerusalem Post speaking to my colleague Lauren Taylor. Egypt has said that intensive discussions between Israel and Hamas on the next phase of the Gaza ceasefire have begun in Cairo. The first phase is set to expire on Saturday, but the agreement says the truce remains in effect during negotiations. Well, let's get more from our Middle East correspondent, Yolande Knell. And Yolande, it's taken a while for these talks to begin. What do we know about what's being discussed at the moment?
Yes, indeed. These talks were delayed. They're supposed to have started a couple of weeks ago, indeed to have been concluded by now if things had stuck to the original timetable. There was just this short statement that came out from the Egyptian side. Of course, Egypt and Qatar are these important regional mediators. It said that there were delegations, Israeli, Qatari, Egyptian and American, that have been meeting in Cairo already, as well as talking about the next stage of the ceasefire. They're also looking at ways to improve humanitarian aid deliveries into Gaza. This statement said, of course, humanitarian aid has surged during the first stage of this ceasefire, which began on the 19th of January. What we've also seen in the past 6 weeks is these exchanges taking place so that 33 Israeli hostages have been returned from the Gaza Strip. 8 of them, though, returned dead. And we have had about 2,000 Palestinian prisoners being released from Israeli jails. At the same time, there's been this partial pullout of Israeli troops from the Gaza Strip. So the substantive nature of the talks is supposed to be about the second stage of the ceasefire. That is supposed to see a permanent end to the fighting, a full Israeli withdrawal from the Gaza Strip in return for the remaining Israeli hostages being brought back. There are still about 60 Israeli hostages, 24 of them said to be alive by the Israeli authorities, who remain in Gaza.
And Yolande, the ceasefire is meant to hold once this first phase elapses. The truce between Israel and Hamas is meant to hold. How confident do people in the region feel about that?
There are some generally sort of positive statements about the nature of these talks, the fact that they are finally taking place. But of course, people have big reservations, particularly about what the Israeli delegation may be mandated to agree. And there is this question mark over whether Israel really wants to resume fighting in the Gaza Strip. We've had the Israeli Prime Minister previously indicating that he would prefer to have an extension of the first phase to see more of these hostage and prisoner exchanges. But Hamas is very unlikely to agree to that in the long term. It wants to see this full end to the fighting.
Yolande, thank you. That's our Middle East correspondent, Yolande Knell in Jerusalem there. Around the world and across the UK, this is BBC News. You're live with BBC News. Now let's get more on our top story and Prime Minister Starmer's visit to Washington. We can speak to our political correspondent Ian Watson, who joins us from Westminster. So a challenging trip for the Prime Minister, to say the least. How much did he achieve?
Well, he certainly achieved, I think, what appeared to be a very convivial meeting, a great deal of bonhomie, and uncharacteristically he was quite tactile, wasn't he, with the American president, touching him on the shoulder, shaking hands quite warmly, or at least succumbing to President Trump's strong grip at certain times. But if you look beyond, if you like, some of the body language and some of the mutual praise, how much was really achieved on the key issues that the Prime Minister wanted to address? The first and most important, I think, was this idea of getting what's called a backstop from the US if there's a peace deal or a ceasefire in Ukraine. What he wanted to make sure was that President Trump would stay engaged, because he felt that that would be, if you like, the biggest bulwark against any future Russian aggression in Ukraine. And he didn't quite get that. All he really got from President Trump was this idea that if they went there to exploit the country's mineral resources, that's something he's discussing with President Zelensky in Washington today. If they went in to do that, then perhaps that would be enough of a disincentive for Vladimir Putin not to interfere in the country in the future. Certainly European leaders want to see a lot more than that. I think elsewhere there's a couple of potential wins on trade, for example. The President praised the Prime Minister for working very hard at their lunch to try to persuade him not to impose tariffs on the UK. He intends to do so on the EU. And he talked about the possibility of a trade deal, but it looks as though that trade deal will be quite narrow, based on tech, based on AI, not a broad across the range trade deal. So whether that would really avoid tariffs remains to be seen. One area I think which Keir Starmer will be pleased about was where he was under domestic political criticism, this idea of effectively leasing back the Chagos Islands from Mauritius and protecting the UK-US base on Diego Garcia. The Conservatives, Reform UK, led by Nigel Farage, have been very critical of giving up UK sovereignty, but Donald Trump said, oh, it looks like it's a long lease, a 140-year lease, he said, and it suggested that he was going to be quite sympathetic to that, although he did have the caveat that he'd have to look more closely at the details. But I think there was an expectation that this deal with Mauritius could be shot down by the US president, and certainly it was far from that. And from Keir Starmer's point of view, coming back to the UK, as he has done in the past hour, he comes armed against some of those criticisms he was facing from opposition parties.
And very briefly, Ian, it's been confirmed that the UK will host a summit on Ukraine this weekend.
That's right, 18 European leaders will be there. There'll be a meeting between the Prime Minister and President Zelensky ahead of that meeting. They'll both then attend that meeting. I think that meeting is important because it certainly is no more than a job half done when it comes to security guarantees for Ukraine. So they'll be discussing, can they put more pressure, I think, on the American administration to provide greater security guarantees themselves, and also have to address the question, what will happen if they fail to do so? What extra resources and what extra security guarantees can they offer to deter future Russian aggression?
Ian, thank you. That's our political correspondent, Ian Watson there. Andrew Tate, the self-confessed misogynist and influencer, has told reporters that he and his brother Tristan are innocent until proven guilty after leaving Romania and landing in Florida on a private jet. The pair, who were arrested in Romania 3 years ago, had their passports returned to them by Romanian prosecutors. But officials said charges of rape and human trafficking against them, which they deny, have not been dropped. Let's get more from our correspondent in Bucharest, Nick Thorpe. And Nick, what are Romanian authorities saying about the manner in which Tristan and Andrew were able to leave Romania?
Well, Catherine, just in the last few minutes, the Romanian Minister of Justice, Radu Marinescu, has called on prosecutors to give a bit more explanation about those circumstances in which the passports were returned. He's saying that the Romanian public are owed a full explanation. So he's not doubting the prosecutors, but he's saying that they really must explain more rather than this terse statement they issued yesterday. Mr. Marinescu, the Romanian Justice Minister, also said that if the Tate brothers fail to come back to Romania to continue facing these charges, very serious charges against them, then they risk jail. Of course, you know, if they're not here, how might the Romanians put them into prison? But that perhaps suggests that there might be, in terms of the negotiations going on, perhaps in the back rooms at a political level, perhaps there might be some kind of agreement between the Romanian and American administration that, that the American administration, the American justice system will make sure that the Tates do return to Romania, which would be an interesting, development if that happens.
Nick, thank you. That's our correspondent, Nick Thorpe in Bucharest there. Jeff Bezos has announced plans for an all-female crew to helm the next flight into space of a Blue Origin rocket. The singer Katy Perry will be among the passengers, who will also include the civil rights activist Amanda Nguyen, the chat show host Gayle King, and Bezos' fiancée Lauren Sanchez. This will be the 11th human flight for the rocket and its 31st overall. It's believed the rocket will carry its passengers into the Kármán line, the internationally recognized boundary of space. The passengers will experience a few minutes of microgravity before returning to Earth. The last recorded all-female space flight was in 1963. Former NASA astronaut Cady Coleman told the BBC about the significance of this announcement.
I've been looking forward to such a thing for a really long time. And, I think that for me, meeting Sally Ride made a big, it never occurred to me to become an astronaut myself until I saw someone a little bit like me. and we need to have a range of role models. And so I think commercial space flight and flights like this one, where it's all women and yet they're all very different from each other. I think that points out that you don't have to be a certain way to have a certain dream. So I think it's a pivotal flight and certainly a very joyous one. These women are amazingly qualified.
And that was the former NASA astronaut Cady Coleman. Before we go, let's update you on the Pope's health. These are live pictures from the Gemelli Hospital in Rome. The latest update from the Vatican said, as in the past days, the night has passed quietly and the Pope is now resting. That statement coming in about 2 hours ago. Of course, we've been getting daily updates from the Vatican on the health of the Pope, who's been hospitalized for 2 weeks now. He initially went into hospital suffering a respiratory tract infection, but of course that infection got worse and he developed pneumonia in both lungs. So at the moment, what we understand from the Vatican is that the Pope had a quiet night and he's now resting. But of course, there are worries about his health, with the Pope being 88 years old. And the Vatican says recovery could take longer because of that. You're watching BBC News with me, Catherine Biarahanga. Stay with us.